Good evening and welcome to The Square. Tonight's discussion is going to focus on gender dimensions and relations during COVID-19. We all celebrated International Women's Day on Monday, 8th March, to make progress and call for change on global efforts to ensure gender equality. In that vein, the show tonight is a reflection of this. We're going to look at the gender equality activities that have been happening in the country over the last couple of years, culminating into what we've seen, emerging trends that we've observed during the COVID-19 pandemic starting from last year. And with us to share the insights, we have our guests, two of them, and I would like by welcoming on behalf of Action Aid, Josephine Uwamaria, who is the Country Director for Action Aid Rwanda. Josephine, it's great to have you on The Square.
Thank you.
We also have with us Mr. Fidel Rutaisire, who is the Executive Director and founder of RUMREC. RUMREC is the Rwanda Men's Resource Center. Mr. Fidel, great to have you on The Square.
Thank you, thank you.
My name is Dan Mpisi, host of The Square. As always, I'm joined by my lovely Square resident panelists. Charles Harbour, always great to have you on the show.
Same here, Diana. How are you?
Good.
Good.
Also joining us, as always, resident panelist on the show, Brenna Namita. Great to have you.
Thank you, Dan.
I know you look... Thank you. I know you're looking forward to tonight's discussion. I know you're passionate about social justice and women's and youth issues. So before we kick off, like we always do, just a couple of midweek highlights from the Square resident panelists, things that they'd like to share with us. Charles, is there anything that's caught your attention?
Just before I thought Meghan meant the news, Meghan and Harry meant the news to the world, then Rwanda kicked in with our vaccination campaign. The level of meticulous organization, the envious way in which everyone is prepared for this. Obviously, it's so easy to say that what else would you expect about delivery and vaccination until you belong to 5 Mudugudu groups that tell you at this day, on this time, at this time, go to that Murenje, go to that Kagari, and so on and so forth. And we take these things for granted. So last night I was watching news from one of our neighboring countries, and this parliament was asking for an extra budget of in excess of $10 million for a distribution campaign when the vaccines were already in the country.
Wow.
Let's not take things for granted. That's number one. Number two, let's give kudos for our organization.
Absolutely. Yeah. Totally agree with you, Charles. Brenna, midweek highlights?
On a lighter note, Kigali is green and the flowers, they look very nice.
Kigali is green and the flowers? Where?
Yes.
I haven't left
See?
much of my...
Just notice the beauty around you.
For me, it's literally
the first
office.
time we have a midweek highlight
Yes.
where both of us have something positive to say.
It's literally from the office to my home. Where in
Yes.
Kigali are you seeing this greenery and the flowers?
Just try to walk around.
Okay.
Get out of the car.
Nice. I like that.
Flowers.
Yes. Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Very nice.
I like the hair.
Thank you. Asante sana. So thank you to our guests for tuning in. To our guests for joining us, Josephine from Action Aid Rwanda and Mr. Fidel Rutaisire from RUMREC. I'm really looking forward to hearing from Fidel, because usually when we have these discussions, we don't have the male engagement perspective with us. You know, the role of men and boys in the campaign, the fight for gender equality, not only across the world, but also in Rwanda. The first question is to just share with us some of the gender dimensions and relations, the emerging trends that have been happening since the break of this pandemic last year. And what we know as the shadow pandemic, this has been referred to as the shadow pandemic, situations whereby there's an increase in domestic violence due to the COVID-19 health crisis. This is due to confinement, there's increased abuse because of issues such as the lockdown, or just even general poverty levels that have led to an increase in gender-based violence. So I'll start with you, Madame Josephine Uwamaria. If you could share with us some emerging trends that your organization and partners have witnessed when it comes to gender relations and dimensions in Rwanda.
Yeah, thank you very much. I wouldn't just start with the 2020 the pandemic, but then let's look at what our society. Let's begin with the society. We have a patriarchal society. We have the gender roles, genderized roles. We have the various opportunities. But when it came to 2020 with this pandemic, the normal became abnormal. Because when you think of the lockdowns, where most of the people were used to actually going for work, working outside the home, maybe having the mom or the woman at home, but also considering the recent women empowerment levels, they wouldn't even stay at home. But here is the lockdown that comes and says, stay at home, and monitoring will be done. And so, at the end of the day, when you look at the relationships, the domestic work, the limited access to the various services, we can say this really created a situation that made life abnormal. And so because if I talk of gender-based violence, in the absence or in the many hours people would actually spend outside the home, that would imply having limited time to fully engage and stay with each other and all that, that before would actually limit the battering that was experienced, the physical violence, the psychological violence of saying, no, moreover, this is not right, or the other one is not right, a lot of misunderstandings. And when we consider the girl child being sexually abused by the people, whether relatives or other male people in the home, when you look at all those challenges, you actually find them and relate them to the issue of having no other time to actually deal with the issues other than staying at home, and victims become many, perpetrators are not followed up, and all that. Then when we come to girls dropping out of school, or children not being able to access school because of the lockdown, then certainly the rate of sexual abuse as well as sexual harassment increased, and the reason why we have had high levels of teenage pregnancies. Because at the end of the day, where the male partners or the male counterparts would otherwise have been preoccupied with their professional activities or business activities and all that, they had all the time at home, and instead of engaging in those other productive activities, they would certainly be trying to get alternatives. And which alternatives? It's sexual encounters, luring the girls, maybe promising petty gifts and all that, as if that is not enough, then they actually would even force them into sex, not because of anything else, but then because of the urge to be promised of either opportunities or for handsets or something like that. So when we look at COVID from a gender perspective, we actually find so many challenges associated with the lockdown, with loss of jobs, with high level of service demands on caring for the infected and for the affected. So I would say it's really been very challenging. We are still in it, but then at least there's a light at the end of the tunnel. Because of even the vaccine that has been received and is being meticulously administered. So there's a light at the end of the tunnel, but the challenges are actually many.
Thank you very much, Josephine. I think the last part of this conversation is going to focus on how we can have a gender lens when looking at the COVID-19 response across the country. I would like to now hear from Mr. Fidel on behalf of RAMREC, on behalf of the partners that you work with. What are some of the key trends you've noticed that have come up in the regarding gender dimensions and relations in Rwanda, in communities across the country?
Well, thank you. Just to add on what Josephine said, gender relations have been deeply affected because even before COVID, the gender relations were affected, but now COVID-19 has deeply affected them because, for instance, when we look at the issue of gender-based violence, even before COVID-19, in the normal time, as you know, 1 out of 3 women have experienced gender-based violence in their lifetime. That is in the normal time. And as you know, in Rwanda, over 35% of women in Rwanda have also experienced gender-based violence. Now, imagine those people during the lockdown were living with their abusers. So, many reports show that, gender-based violence has increased. For instance, the physical violence has increased by 5% during the lockdown. And the lockdown has also affected the social, political, and health context. When you look at the education, children were staying at home, and the women's burden on unpaid care work, it has also been worsened because they had burden to look after children, but also to look after their husband or after their partners. So gender relations have been deeply affected. And there are many circumstances, many parameters which are causing the gender dimensions being affected because, for instance, when you look at the number of hours which women work during the normal time, it has doubled during the lockdown. And also when you look at the access to services, in the normal time, victims have where to report, they have, they can call hotlines, they can go to Isango One-Stop Centers, but during the lockdown, it was not possible. So response was not possible during the lockdown. So only the raising awareness through radios, through social media was available, but in reality, services to survivors of gender-based violence was not really available. Yeah, thank you.
So, based on what you and Josephine are saying, women have definitely been disproportionately affected by the pandemic, even more so than they were before the pandemic regarding gender-based violence. I'd like to hear from the panelists. Brenna, I'll kick off with you, just commenting on what our guests have said, but also sharing some of your views on this matter.
I hope we'll get to hear more from Josephine because they've done research on this issue, and I think what was clear from the baseline study that they did was that women and girls were really affected. But my concern is, even if we'll get back to it, the response going forward, because we are already seeing children are back to school now, where these girls, teenage girls who got pregnant, how are we taking care of them? Or have we moved on? Because when they said schools have reopened, I didn't hear anything about if you got pregnant during the pandemic or during the lockdown, this is what we'll do for you. I think we need that to happen now. Otherwise, we'll lose these girls. Now, with gender-based violence, of course, as they've mentioned, it's very painful because even when you have centers where people are supposed to go and get the help, it doesn't really solve the issue because most of the time, first of all, the centers are not really well resourced to deal with the issues at hand. They're overwhelmed. So the more, in my view, the more important and urgent need is how do you stop or prevent the violence from happening in the first place? And I think there's a big gap there, because if this woman is going to wait, if you're going to receive them after they've been beaten probably 10 times, and you're waiting for physical marks, because when you go, whether it's rape, they will ask for the evidence. It's very difficult. So the more difficult work is how do you prevent it from happening? Now, I don't have answers, but I think we have people who are specialists in these fields that can do something about it. And we saw during the lockdown, for the first time, some couples were in the same space for the longest time. For the first time, since the wedding. This is real. Because normally after the wedding, people have maybe a week or two, and after that, someone is off to work maybe, and every morning they probably leave at 5, and they are back midnight. And then suddenly these people find themselves in the same space. They're as good as strangers. So unfortunately it already happened, and women have had, I'm sorry, I'm going to insist and talk about women, because I feel women again tend to be overwhelmed, because you have the childcare, and then now there's working from home, and then you have the husband to take care of, and there's bound to be friction. First of all, maybe as a woman, you're used to your routine of just taking care of the children, and suddenly this man is spending the whole day at home, and you don't know what to do with them.
Yes.
So I feel that I hope we've taken the lessons going forward. It's not, there's no silver bullet, but I feel that there's more work that can be done to improve, because, we are still in a pandemic, and just because we are out of the lockdown does not mean GBV will go down automatically. It doesn't actually mean so. So there's room to, one, improve the existing spaces where these women report. Because I know of a case of a friend who I actually made the reference that you go to one of these places that they say they help women. And when she got there, she couldn't even bother speak to the person who was receiving her because she felt the first impression of the response, was like, we are busy, wait. And she called back and said, I don't think they will actually help me, just from the first impression. So there are several things that need to be fixed, yeah? It's not easy, but I feel that the deliberate steps that we have seen in closing the gender gap, priority has to also be placed on protecting especially women in homes. Now, if you're a woman and you're working, sometimes it's easier. Stay-home moms have limited options. So how we design interventions that really respond specifically, for instance, if you're a stay-home mom, what do you do? How do you deal with these issues? I think this is a conversation that we need to have.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We are going to definitely get back to our guests on your point. We are going to get back to Madame Josephine on if you can give us some of the steps forward, the next steps forward in terms of, let's say, protecting, talking about these girls who maybe were, impregnated teenage girls during the pandemic, obviously unwanted teenage pregnancies. If you could have a discussion on the way forward in dealing with people who are affected, women who are affected by the pandemic regarding gender-based violence, unwanted teenage pregnancies, that sort of thing. We'll also go to Mr. Fidel regarding what Brenna mentioned. The idea is to deal with prevention of gender-based violence. And I think the work RAMREC does, working with men and boys, would be a great example in sharing with us some of the insights you have. But before we go to both of you, Josephine and Fidel, I would like to also just hear from our resident panelist, Charles.
Thank you, Diana. Two things. One, on a lighter note, and then secondly, around male engagement. On a lighter note, Rwanda has these abbreviations and acronyms that sometimes you wonder what you come across. So until we had the square today, I didn't know what RAMREC was. I thought that RAMREC was Rwanda Men's Real Estate Commissionaires. But thanks to you, Diana, I know what Fidel does and what RAMREC is, stands for, yes, or what it is in full.
Rwanda Men's Resource Center.
Thank you.
Yes.
But on a serious note around male engagement, and I think I probably challenge Madame Josephine and everyone else in the NGO world, and all of us probably, including myself, around the male engagement, and I think that's really where it matters most. We have tended to think all over time that it's about women empowerment and women should empower themselves. And that's the conversation that has been going around all the time, that, you are a woman, you should be strong, work for yourself. You're Diana, you own Blue Oceans, you produce the Square, you're Josephine, you run ActionAid, you can do better than any man anywhere in the world. You're Bana, you run Nation Media Group, you can do much better than any other man in the world. You're there on merit. I think that narrative, it's high time that narrative changed, and as men, we put ourselves in a position where, and it's even more deliberate, where we ensure we have an obligation to ensure that we protect the woman. Now, I've obviously said this before on the show, and I'll always sing it again. I have 4 daughters and my wife. I'm surrounded by women. I come here every Wednesday. I'm surrounded by women. I think I'm vulnerable. I think I'm extremely vulnerable, but that's on the light side. But on a very serious note, is there a campaign that actually ensures RAMREC, now that I know what they stand for, and others, ActionAid, what they stand for? When is it that we are going to be given a wake-up call as men to say it is our obligation to ensure all this conversation we've been having for the last 10 minutes is our obligation? And I think that's really the missing link, because in as long as we don't realize that it is our obligation, I am one of the biggest campaigners against quota system. This rubbish of saying that 30% of women should be in parliament. This rubbish of saying that we need to have we need to brag about the number of women whom we have in positions of responsibility. I'm totally against it. Women can be there on merit. They don't have to be there because we need a representation. And it's been proven. But the responsibility lies with us as men.
Can I also just start by challenging that? I think, Charles, that's a totally different discussion for another day. But I think the quota system, this sort of deliberate representation, is based on entrenched systems that, for time immemorial, have denied women these spaces. So there's deliberate action to try and solve these gaps because of these deep-seated, patriarchal, systematic issues that have denied women these opportunities. But that's another discussion for another day. Brenna, I would like you to hold that thought, but I would like us... Yeah. Sorry?
Very briefly.
Yes, okay.
I mean, I don't see why men feel that they need the campaign. They should, I mean, these women are in front of them. They have daughters, they have sisters, they have wives. These are people in front of you. So I would appreciate if Charles said, I take up the responsibility as Charles within my space to get even more men to understand the importance of, protecting women. You don't need a campaign. Start with you, Charles.
No.
Your 10 friends.
If you come to me, it will be a totally different story. My wife runs my home. That's number one. I have more than 78% staff representation in my business. So I may not be the best example to give, but the point I'm raising is it has to be very deliberate across all men. So I may not be the best example to give, Bana. Maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it would have been difficult to have a conversation around women who can prove themselves. And I'll probably challenge you, Bana, Diana, Josephine. All of you run your own businesses and your own organizations. How many organizations of your caliber were run by women? You have not been given favors. You are there on merit. So whichever man is there in a boardroom, in a decision-making organ, should not be driven by quota system.
But I just pointed out the reason for these quota systems. You cannot ignore years and years and years of deliberate systemic oppression against women.
That's a completely different issue.
Exactly, which is why I said...
I like that you mention what you're doing, with your company, at home. What I would expect is that you're going to be the champion.
Not wait to be...
be the champion. Speak to your 10 male friends and get them to do exactly
what you're saying.
Sorry, enough. We are here with our guests to focus on some other issues. That's a totally different conversation for another day, quota systems, filling in these gaps. But I would like us to just, I know we said we'd start off with Josephine, but I think this direction, we're really keen to hear about men. And I'd like the segue to just go into starting off with Fidel. Fidel, RAMREC, as Charles just found out, Rwanda Men's Resource Center, is one of the few organizations in Rwanda that has been working with male engagement and promoting positive masculinities for the longest time as it has been in existence. I think you kicked off in 2006. There are other organizations, but I think RAMREC was the first to get into this field. So if you could just share with us, what do you mean when you talk about positive male masculinities, when you talk about male engagement in the fight for gender equality? Just share a bit with us the work that RAMREC does, and define also for us and our viewers the terms that we've seen that you use a lot in your work, engaging with men and boys and communities across the country.
Okay, thank you very much. Charles, I would like to invite you to our men's groups. So we have what we call men's clubs.
Nice.
And men's groups. So please welcome.
I prefer to be on the women's side.
Yes. So first of all, let's agree on why do we really need to engage men and boys. As Diana said, we are in a patriarchal society. So we have patriarchal values. Everything is male-dominated. We, the men, we hold the power. We are the custodian of the culture. We are part of the solution, but also part of the problems. And we are in every sphere of life. Look at the leadership. We hold the power in leadership, we hold the power of economy, we hold the power on sex and reproductive health. So if we really need to have a change, we have to engage men. And for any change to happen, there has to be a gender transformation, which involves identifying the need that men need to practice into their behaviors, their relations, their attitudes. So we need men as allies. We need to work with men and boys as partners, as clients, as victims, and men as perpetrators. So now we started this men's organization in order to first contribute to eradicate violence against women, in order to help men to take care of themselves, because men are also affected by gender roles. Men are also vulnerable. Men don't take care of themselves. When you look at the number of suicide, men are the majority people who make suicide. When you look at drugs, alcohol, men are at the forefront. So we need to work with them in order to change the patriarchal system. So we at RAMREC, we have done, for instance, a research on perceptions about masculinity, what men think about what it means to be a man in the Rwandan context, what women think about being a woman, being a man. And for instance, we interviewed 3,000 men about gender roles. For instance, there was one question asking, who do you think, for instance, changing the diapers of a child, do you think it's a role of who? 80% of men said, of course, it is the responsibility of women. And interestingly, 90% of women said it's the responsibility of women. And we also asked, do you think sometimes it makes sense to beat your wife when she has not well cooked? 90% of women said, yes, it makes sense. 80% of women said, yes, it makes sense. So all these perceptions are problematic. So now, in the Rwandan context, what it means to be a man, a real man, many Rwandan men will tell you to be a real man means to be sexually strong, to have multiple partners, to be a provider of the family, to be, to provide the safety of your family. All those negative perceptions or negative masculinity perceptions are the root causes of the gender inequalities, because it's all about power relations. And now, if we need to have a real change, then we need to engage men as allies to women, because we should recognize that women have started this struggle for gender equality, and we, the men, we are not there to be in charge, but we are there to be allies. We are working hand in hand with the women's organizations to bring men on board and change their behaviors, their attitudes, their manhood, what it means to be a man, so that when they become gender equitable men, then the gender inequalities will also be reduced. So it is very important to engage men as allies, but as clients, as partners, as victims, as perpetrators, because we cannot achieve a real gender equality without bringing men on board, because they still have the power in everything. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fidel. Josephine, if we can go to you, sharing with us insights from the work ActionAid does with government, with different civil society actors as well. What are some of the, if you could give us some figures, as Berna alluded to earlier on, in terms of the impact of this pandemic regarding gender dimensions, but most importantly, the way forward. Going forward, what are some of your recommendations? Berna talked about, schools are reopening, but there's no mention anywhere about unwanted teenage pregnancies during the lockdown that happened. What are we doing with these sorts of young people that have been affected? If you could just shed some light on this, Josephine.
Yeah, thank you. Well, when we look at the effect of COVID from a gender perspective, using exactly the issue of teenage pregnancies, the numbers actually tripled compared to 2016, 2018. And what does that mean? It means responsibility over the young mother, taking care of the child, and the child not being loved because the perpetrator maybe escaped and is unable to provide support. The child will not have even health insurance because he's not a member of the family and all that. What a way forward is, let's engage and have those issues factored into our policies, so that, because once a girl is raped and becomes pregnant, then should be taken care of. So there should be services to respond, to ensure reintegration of the child, because even the parents do not actually receive positively that baby and the young mom who is actually taking the responsibility that had not even been planned. So from the policy perspective, it's become clear that certainly sexual violence is there, resulting into unplanned or unwanted pregnancies because they are actually not planned. And the perpetrators, who are the men, because of their power, either can use force, can use economic power, and all that. So going forward, men should actually take responsibility, be able to say, if anything happens, then I'm responsible. And considering the children that are born, and the mom, the young mom, even loses the opportunity of continuing with education, resulting into going down the poverty line. I think even in developing our policies and designing interventions, we need to bring in all those perspectives, because in the normal circumstances before the pandemic, it was like the girl has equal opportunities with the boy to attain education, certainly, but when it comes to the sexual perspective, the sexuality perspective, once raped, once lured into sex, then it results into pregnancy. Compared to the boy, because I regret we've also had cases with where boys have been sexually violated, but the impact or the result is not the same. So the burden is not the same. So those are the gender perspectives that we need to
factor in.
Put into consideration in even designing the policies, the services that are being initiated and other interventions, because the gender perspective certainly has its own peculiarities and the burden on the girl and the woman.
I would like to just take this now to Charles and Berna. The final segment of this show, I would like to hear on your recommendations or your expectations moving forward in a post-COVID world. Right now towards that day, hopefully it will come sooner than we think. But what would you like to see in terms of the responses, starting from this pandemic that tripled, as Madame Josephine said, some of the negative impacts on gender relations and gender dimensions brought about by this pandemic. What would your expectations be from a policy perspective, from a Rwandan, citizen perspective, on how we start addressing gender relations moving forward? And Charles, I'll kick off with you.
I'm glad you started with me, but I'll go to something that I disagree a lot with Bana and yourself sometimes, Diana. In my opinion, Rwandan women have come a long way. They, especially at the top echelon, they need no more favors. They fought their way, and the rest of the battle remains with the men. I think Madame Josephine has alluded to that. Fidel sort of agrees with me. I think the battle remains with us as men. And to a very large extent, we probably need some education. But even women also need to understand, just this might sound a little bit wrong. Don't assume that you deserve any favors, and many of you do not. Many of you do not deserve any favors. Most of you know you don't deserve any favors. But the onus remains on us men to know that women are there on merit.
And I think also the onus is on men
Yes.
to act in such a way whereby
Yes.
we don't even have to think of favors for women
Yes.
based on the actions of men.
Absolutely.
That create this,
Absolutely.
You know, this
and
circumstances.
on that point, I'll sort of thank you so much, Diana, because I'll to a very large extent, I'll to a certain extent, I'll disagree with Auntie Josephine there too. You know these favors that women get, money, and she was alluding to certain things that men give women. Women need to be empowered to the extent, say, you know, even if you're getting...
Charles, can I say
Yes.
something?
Yes, please.
We recently did a research
Yes.
in 8 districts of Rwanda, looking at the women's participation in local politics, looking at the role of men in the masculinities. So we found out that one of the reasons why Rwanda is still lagging behind in terms of having women in leadership at the grassroots level is because of negative masculinity perceptions at grassroots level. So men are playing a big role in that. And actually, women are not asking for favor. When you look at, for instance, the number of women who are mayors or who are vice mayors in charge of economics, so it's 10% of women who are vice mayors in charge of economics. Now, when we say Rwanda is lagging behind in terms of women at grassroots level leadership, then we are not talking about favor. It doesn't mean that women do not have the capacity to be a vice mayor in charge of economics. But when a woman presents her application to be a vice mayor for economic affairs, do you know who are against that?
Fellow women.
Which are men. So
No, Fidel, I think you and I...
Let's let him finish,
yes.
please. Yes.
So you talked about men having responsibility. Yes, the men, we should be accountable of our power, our perceptions, because we have noticed that men don't want to release their power and their advantages, their benefits, which they got from the system. And now, looking at the number of men who have been able to change in our groups, so we are using those men as a community activists to change their peers so that they can transform the whole community. But again, we have seen that we still have a long way. So we need to use those few men who have been transformed to transform their peers.
Thank you very much.
Yes, can I just
Charles,
say,
No,
very briefly.
Not
very
Charles.
briefly.
Let's hear from Bernard then. Just keep that
I
with
wanted
you.
to just say something
Because
about
Charles-
sending a thief to catch a thief. And that's the point Fidel is saying. That,
Charles, I'm sorry, we don't have enough time. Yeah, you made your point. Fidel challenged it. Let's have that, keep that for another conversation. But in the interest of time, I'd like to give a chance for everyone to just share their views. Bernard, you know, your expectations moving forward, especially in light with what this pandemic has taught us regarding gender relations, very briefly.
I must respond to Charles.
Well, I just want you to know, in the
Yes,
interest of
and-
time, I will have
and
to make that brief. Yes.
Nobody's asking for favors. That is number one. Number two, Charles's circles, friends, women, are the elite.
Not,
and this is
not
like
the grassroots level.
Yeah, and these are like 0.5. So when we talk about we've made progress, we're just looking at our friends who are CEOs, we're looking at our friends who are... That is not the majority.
Absolutely.
When we talk about women empowerment, we want the majority. And the majority of women in this country that we know are up country. They still walk to work. We still have illiterate women. We still have women that are breadwinners, that are everything, but still don't have the social protection. So let us not be mistaken by the 0.5 that we see, you know, in leadership positions. Now, going forward, I feel that, first of all, we cannot ignore the problem of teenage pregnancies. As a country, we cannot fail these young children. They are children, they are not women, they are not anything, these are children. And children should be in school, not anywhere else. So we must be very deliberate in protecting these young children. Let them have the babies if possible. I mean, there's been, again, the other debate of access to contraception. It's a big debate. You know, we have moralists, but let's protect these children. We can't just wash it away. Now, my final submission is on the bailout. If you look at the budget, we've been bailing out businesses. We've been, you know, trying to give a push to the economy. Can we come up with a specific fund that looks at addressing the needs of women? Because we know, I mean, the figures are out there for us. They're out there for everybody, that the pandemic has disproportionately affected women and girls. So let's do something. Because we talk about these things day in, day out.
Yeah.
Yes, let's stop talking and just do it.
I totally agree with you, Brenna. We've come to the end of our show. I would like just very briefly closing remarks from Madame Josephine and Fidel. If you can, as brief as you can, what are some of your thoughts on the next steps? Just briefly, just an idea for you to share on how we can move forward regarding this issue. Madame Josephine, I'll kick off with you.
Yeah.
Very briefly, please.
We need childcare services for those children born of the teen mothers, so that the mothers can actually go back to school, because that's what we encourage them to do. But then where do they leave their children? There should be childcare services. And there should be services, support, either some fund to provide for those girls or those mothers who were unfortunate to be in the situation they did not want to. So there should be a fund to facilitate their integration.
Thank you very much, Josephine. Fidel, very briefly, over to you, your final words.
Yeah, we need justice to these children. We need justice to these teen mothers, but also we need to deal with the teen fathers, and we need reintegration, community reintegration of these teen mothers, and also we need to hold accountable men who are perpetrators.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Charles, very quickly, over to you.
Yes. I think whether it's for women or men, we need to address the culture of keeping quiet.
Absolutely.
Silence.
Yeah. Megan opened her mouth to the world.
Yeah.
Rwandan women, Rwandan men, we should not keep quiet about all these silences and challenges that we have within our homes. Yes. So the culture of keeping quiet should be suppressed.
Absolutely. Yes. I like saying in this circle, silence is violence.
Yes.
The more silent you are, this is promoting gender-based violence. Thank you very much, Josephine and Mr. Fidel. Thank you very much for coming on the show. Brenna, thank you very much. Always a pleasure to have you. Very passionate and heated as usual. Thanks, Charles, for always bringing the debate and the spice to these shows. To our viewers, thank you for tuning in. To our Made in Rwanda partners, Uzi Collections and Bourbon Coffee, thank you for always supporting The Square. Please keep the conversation going using the hashtag The Square RW, as you can see on your screens on our social media channels. Visit our YouTube page, The Square Rwanda, to keep abreast with all our shows, past, present. Thank you very much. Have a good night, and see you all again next week.